The ship was already dying when Roan Vess called the alien a son of a bitch. It wasn't a particularly clever thing to say. It wasn't even accurate, in the biological sense. The Keth didn't reproduce the way humans did. And the concept of a bitch, of a mother who whelped you wet and howling into the world, was something that simply did not exist in their reproductive taxonomy. But the sentiment translated just fine. He knew that, because the Keth pilot turned its three-eyed face toward him for a half-second before punching the collision alarm. And in that half-second, Roan saw something cross its features that might have been irritation, and might have been something older and less nameable. Then the hull peeled open and everything got very loud. He came around on a gurney in the Ferris Station medical bay, lights too bright, the smell of antiseptic and scorched polymer strong enough to taste. A medic was pressing something cold against the side of his neck and saying words that didn't assemble into meaning for the first 4 or 5 seconds. When they did, Roan decided he didn't care for them. Words like critical and stable and lucky to be alive. He'd heard all three before in that exact combination, and they had never once led anywhere good. How long, he said. 18 hours. He tried to sit up. The medic pushed him back down with a firmness that suggested she'd done it before and expected to do it again. Outside the bay's narrow window, the black of deep space was punctured by the spinning structure of the asteroid mining platform they called the Shelf. 60 kilometers of carved-out rock and prefabricated corridors sitting atop the richest vein of solite ever discovered by human hands. Solite. That was what started all of this. He let the medic work. He closed his eyes and let the last 3 weeks reassemble themselves behind his eyelids, the way you reconstruct a dream before the morning fully takes it. It had started with a job. It always started with a job. Roan Vess had been, in a previous and more optimistic chapter of his life, a field investigator for the Interstellar Commerce Authority. That chapter had ended badly, in the way that chapters involving corporate corruption, a suppressed evidence file, and 2 dead colleagues tend to end badly. He'd landed on Ferris Station the way debris lands on anything, by falling. The station was the sort of place that collected people who had run out of other places to go. 12,000 humans, 400 Keth observers, and a rotating population of mining contractors who worked the solite seams in pressure suits and came back quieter than they left. He ran a small investigative consultancy out of a 2-room office wedged between a noodle bar and a hydroponic supply depot. The sign on the door said Vess Solutions, in letters that had never quite dried right on the low-gravity surface. He did background checks. He found missing persons. He untangled the petty frauds and contract disputes that Ferris Station generated the way any human habitat generated carbon dioxide, constantly, involuntarily, and in amounts that could kill you if they built up long enough. He was in the middle of a very dull insurance case when Mara Solon walked through the door. She was expensively dressed for a mining station, which meant her coat was real fabric, and her boots had been maintained. She had the kind of face that had probably been symmetrical once, and was still striking despite everything life had done to rearrange it. She sat in the chair across from his desk without being invited, and folded her hands in her lap the way people fold their hands when they are controlling. Something that wants very much not to be controlled. "I want you to find out who killed my brother," she said. Roan leaned back in his chair and looked at her. The IKE cleared that as an industrial accident. The IKE is run by people who work for Axiom Corp. He knew that. Everyone knew that. It was the kind of knowledge that sat in the back of your teeth, acidic and useless, because knowing it didn't change it. Axiom Corp held the solite mining license for this entire sector. They paid the salaries of 14,000 station employees, funded the station's medical system, and had enough pull in the Interstellar Commerce Authority that the distinction between the company and the regulator had become primarily cosmetic. "Your brother was the lead safety engineer," Roan said. "He found something wrong with the solite processing stream. He filed a report." She opened the bag she'd brought and slid a data wafer across the desk. 3 days later, he was dead. "What kind of something wrong?" She met his eyes. "The kind that turns people into ash." Solite was, on paper, a miracle. In the 14 years since the first deep core vein had been struck in this asteroid field, the energy compound had remade the economics of deep space. It burned cleaner than anything that had preceded it. The power density was extraordinary. Every major human colony within 4 light years was running on solite-based grid systems by the time Roan arrived on Ferris Station, and the mining operation on the Shelf was producing enough to extend that reach further still. What the Axiom Corp Public Communications Division did not discuss was what happened when Solite was improperly contained. The data wafer contained 17 incident files. Most of them were what the company officially called thermal cascade events. Equipment failures, elevated temperatures, sensor malfunctions. But Mara's brother, a careful man named Joris Solon, who had annotated everything in small, precise handwriting, had noticed a pattern. The thermal cascade events clustered around one specific processing corridor. The injuries associated with them were not burns, not in the conventional sense. They were combustion events. Workers who walked into the containment failure zone did not come out with burns. They came out as fine gray powder in their suits, or they did not come out at all. Joris Solon had calculated, over the course of 8 months of unauthorized testing, that improperly stabilized Solite was not releasing energy. It was rearranging molecular bonds at a speed and specificity that targeted biological tissue. It consumed carbon-based organic matter with a selectivity that no naturally occurring compound had any business having. He had written, in the last entry of the last file, the following sentence: "This is not a natural property of Solite." Someone added this. 3 days after that entry, Joris Solon had been reported dead in an unrelated maintenance accident in a different section of the station entirely. Rohn read the files twice. Then he called his old contact in the station police, a lieutenant named Pris Halvard, who had the specific weariness of someone who had been right about things for a long time, without that rightness ever benefiting her. She met him in the commissary at a table in the back corner, and drank her coffee like someone who had given up expecting it to be good. "Solon's death," he said. "Closed case, Pris, I know." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I know what it looks like. I also know who controls the evidence archive on this station, and I know what my pension looks like if I push this the wrong way." She looked at him. "What are you going to do with it?" "Find out who modified the Solite." She was quiet for a moment. "There are 4 Keth sitting in on the Solite review board," she said. Axiom invited them. No explanation given. They arrived 6 weeks before Joris Solon died. "You think the Keth are involved?" "I think it is very interesting that a species with no need for Solite power has 4 representatives sitting on a human mining operations safety review board." She stood up. "I also think that if you find evidence of what I think you're going to find, you should be very careful about who you give it to and how fast you run." The Keth had arrived at the edges of human space 11 years ago, in ships that human engineers still could not fully replicate, which was itself a kind of answer to a question nobody had officially asked yet. They were tall, bilaterally symmetrical in the broad sense, but asymmetrical in detail. The left side of a Keth's face carried 1 eye and 1 sensory cluster, while the right carried 2 eyes, and an olfactory structure that worked in ranges no human instrument could quite pin down. They communicated in layered harmonics that required a translation device to make audible to human ears, but they learned human languages faster than any human learned Keth. They were officially trading partners. They had technology humans wanted, and they accepted Solite as partial currency. The exchange rate was set by a joint committee that had never, in 11 years of operation, changed the terms in any direction that didn't favor the Keth. Nobody talked about that out loud either. Rohn had worked with a Keth twice in his icy years. Once in a trade dispute, once in what was officially classified as a cultural incident, and which had involved a dead human dock worker and a set of circumstances the Keth representative had described as a misunderstanding. He had found them unsettling in a way he couldn't fully articulate, which was not a feeling he experienced with other species. It was something about the way they watched, not the eyes. Human faces watched with their eyes, and you could read the direction of attention in the tilt of a skull or the track of a pupil. Keth watched with their whole bodies. They absorbed information the way a sponge absorbed water, with no visible preference for what came in. You couldn't tell what mattered to them, because everything they encountered appeared to matter equally, and you could never tell if you were being catalogued or dismissed. He spent 2 days being invisible around them. He ate in the same commissary sections, used the same transit corridors, found reasons to be in proximity to the shelf's administrative levels where the Solite review board met. He was very good at being invisible. It was the one skill from his ICA years that had survived intact. On the 3rd day he found the lab. It wasn't hidden exactly, which was a specific kind of boldness that he filed away for later consideration. It was in a maintenance subsection off the secondary processing corridor, marked with standard restricted access signage that could be overridden with a station engineer's credential, which Joris Solon had been, which was why Joris Solon had found it. The equipment inside was not human manufacture. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the workstations, the fluid containment vessels, the processing units that had no human analog he could identify. The room smelled of something metallic and sweet, which he recognized after a moment as the Keth equivalent of a lab environment. They used a chemical compound in their research spaces the way humans used filtered air systems to maintain a specific atmospheric baseline. The smell meant someone used this room regularly and recently. On the bench nearest the door was a sample container. Inside it, visible through the transparent wall, was a quantity of processed solite that was a shade darker than standard, almost brown at the edges, almost amber. He took a photograph and left the way he came, quickly, without touching anything. That was when the trouble began in earnest. Pris Halvard pulled him out of his office at 4 in the morning station time, with the expression of someone who has been awake for a very long time, with very little to show for it. She had 2 uniformed officers with her, and the kind of apologetic body language that told him she wasn't arresting him, but that someone further up the chain very much wanted her to. Axiom has filed a complaint, she said. On-site access to restricted facility. They have your biometrics from the corridor scan. I was lost. Roan, I was very lost. Those maintenance corridors all look the same. She pulled him aside from the officers and dropped her voice. They also pulled the transit logs from that section. The Keth Review Board members filed a separate report. They're claiming you were surveilling a protected diplomatic facility. She looked at him steadily. A diplomatic facility, Roan? That's not a station offense. That's an Interstellar Commerce Authority jurisdictional issue. The ICEA that's run by people who work for Axiom Corp. Yes, he looked at her. She looked back. In the space between them was everything that they both understood, and neither either of them could say without consequences that would eat them alive. I need 48 hours, he said. I need to bring you in now. I need 48 hours, Pris. She was quiet for a very long 3 seconds. I'll lose the paperwork in transit, she said finally. 40 hours, not 48. 40, he nodded once. He went back into his office and started moving. Mara Solon was harder to find than he expected, which was its own kind of information. A woman with her resources and profile should have been easy to locate on a station with 12,000 residents and a limited number of transit options. The fact that she wasn't meant she knew she might need to disappear and had prepared for it. He found her through a chain of contacts that involved a black market hydroponics merchant, a retired ICA analyst who owed him a favor from 3 years back, and one very uncomfortable conversation in a service corridor with a man who introduced himself only as Fingers and smelled of machine oil and evasion. She was in a transit pod bay on the station's outer ring, the kind of place where cargo handlers waited between shifts and where the security coverage had 2 predictable gaps per cycle. She looked like she hadn't slept. You found the lab, she said. It wasn't a question. Tell me about the Life Militia. She was quiet for long enough that he started to wonder if she was going to answer. Then, my brother wasn't just a safety engineer. He'd been in contact with them for 2 years. They're human rights people, basically. Activist scientists. They started because of the early Solite incidents, the ones Axiom covered up before the shelf was operational. She pulled her coat tighter. They're not violent. I want to be clear about that. Whatever else you've heard, they don't believe in violence. Someone blew up a transit station on Corridor 7 last month. The ICA blamed Life Militia. The ICA blamed a lot of things on Life Militia. Her voice was controlled, but underneath it something was burning the way Solite burned, hot and specific and without smoke. My brother found out what Axiom was really doing with the Solite modification. Not the combustion risk. That's what's in his files, but that's not all of it. The combustion risk is a byproduct. It's what you get when the process goes wrong. She met his eyes. What you get when it goes right is a compound that dissolves biological tissue at a molecular level, selectively, controllably, at range, in any quantity they want to produce. They're not mining an energy source, Roan. They're manufacturing a weapon. He sat with that for a moment. Who's buying it, he said. Who do you think? The Keth Review Board, the Keth who had no use for solite as energy. The Keth who set trading terms that never moved against them, who arrived in ships no human engineer could replicate, who watched everything with their whole bodies and gave nothing away. They're building a weapon using human workers on a human station with a compound that only exists on human licensed territory, he said. And if it ever gets traced, it never gets traced. That's the point. The Keth don't produce it anywhere near their own space. They don't touch it. They have humans produce it, and humans die in the testing, and the ICA writes it up as industrial accidents, and nobody ever looks hard enough to see what's underneath. She exhaled slowly. My brother, look, that's why he's dead. Roan stood up. The transit pod bay hummed around them, the deep mechanical respiration of a station doing what it was built to do, moving things from one place to another through the cold. I need to access the main Solite processing archive, he said. The real one, not the version they show the safety board. You'll need a Keth access credential. I know. Do you know how to get one? I know someone who might. She reached into her coat and produced a small data chip, which she held out to him. Joris's last backup. The complete documentation, including the chemical analysis of the modified compound. Her hand was steady. Whatever you do with this, make sure it goes somewhere that Axiom and the Keth can't both reach. He took it. He didn't make promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The person who knew about Keth access credentials was an old man named Waxman, who ran an odds and ends shop in the station's secondary commercial ring, and who had, in a previous life, been an intelligence officer for one of the Earth-based governments before the Interstellar Commerce Authority rendered most Earth-based governments irrelevant. He was small and compact, and moved with the economy of someone who had learned long ago that large gestures attracted attention. He sold machine parts, mostly, and played a game involving tiles that Roan did not understand and had never had the patience to learn. He was also, as far as Roan could determine, the only human on the station who had spent significant time in Keth-controlled space and come back sane and talkative. You want a credential, Waxman said, moving a tile without looking up. I want to understand how their authentication works. That's the same thing. He finally looked up. He had the kind of eyes that had seen too many specific things to be surprised by categories. They use biometric harmonics. Not fingerprints, not retina. They authenticate on the resonance pattern of your secondary vocal cords. Every Keth has a unique harmonic signature that their systems read in about a quarter second when you touch a panel. Humans don't have secondary vocal cords. Correct. Which is why no human has ever accessed a Keth system through legitimate means. He set down the tile. I, however, have something interesting. He went to the back of the shop and returned with a small device that Roan didn't recognize. Took it off a Keth communications officer 17 years ago in circumstances I won't describe. It's a harmonic emitter. It broadcast a recorded Keth signature on contact. I have 3 signatures on it, all of deceased Keth individuals, so there's no living owner to notice the ping. He held it out. I will give this to you on one condition. What condition? You take me with you when you go in. Roan looked at him. Why? Because I have been waiting for 17 years for someone to find what I think you're about to find. And I am not spending another 17 years on the odds of it happening again. He set the device on the table. Also because I know the secondary access route into the main processing archive, and you don't, and neither does anyone else currently alive who's willing to help you. Roan picked up the device. How soon can you move? I've been ready since Tuesday. The main Solite processing archive was not on the shelf. It was on a secondary structure 3 kilometers off the main station body, connected by a pressurized transit tunnel that showed up on the public schematics as a supply conduit. The structure itself was listed as an auxiliary power relay station. It had no entry in the station's employee registry, no maintenance schedule in the public database, and no designation in the emergency evacuation routes. It also had, Waxman had explained, a single Keth access terminal on its exterior surface, accessible via a maintenance walkway on the station's outer hull. They went at the top of the station's sleep cycle, when the corridor traffic was lowest and the security rotation had its narrowest window. Pris Halvard had been right about 40 hours. He had used 29 of them. He didn't let himself think about what that meant for the remaining 11. The maintenance walkway was exactly as unpleasant as promised. A meter-wide catwalk bolted to the exterior of a metal structure in a vacuum, with no cover, no handholds beyond the safety rail, and a view of the asteroid field that was genuinely beautiful in the way that things which can kill you often are. The Keth access terminal was a smooth panel set into the structure's outer wall, featureless except for a small contact surface. Waxman pressed the harmonic emitter against it. There was a pause that lasted long enough for Roan to imagine a dozen failure scenarios. Then the panel slid back and the access tunnel opened. Inside was exactly what Joris Solin's files had suspected and more than either of them had anticipated. The archive was not just documentation, it was an active facility. Processing units, sample storage, automated assembly systems running without human oversight. The modified Solite, The amber-brown compound he'd seen in the sample container was being produced here in quantities that had nothing to do with research. This was manufacturing. This was production at scale. The storage units along the back wall held dozens of containment vessels, each labeled in Keth's script, each with a small indicator light that showed green for stable and ready. Waxman's moved through the room with the calm of someone who had been steeling himself for this moment for a long time. He connected a recording device to the main data terminal and began pulling files. Roan watched the door. "How much do you need?" Roan said. "All of it." "How long?" 11 minutes. "We have 7, then I need 8. They had 6. The Keth came in through the far entrance, 2 of them in the smooth, deliberate motion that was their version of urgency. They were not armed, which was the first surprise. The second surprise was that one of them spoke. Not through a translator, not in harmonics. In standard human lingua, accented but clear. "You are not supposed to be here," it said. Not threatening, not alarmed. Simply stating a fact with the patience of something that has all the time it needs. "This facility is protected under Interstellar Commerce Covenant. So is the right to life," Roan said. "Funny how that one keeps getting filed under industrial accidents." The Keth that had spoken angled its head. The other one moved sideways, slowly in the way that Roan recognized as positioning, establishing an angle, measuring the room. He'd seen it in ICA arrest situations, the geometry of containment. "You have accessed materials belonging to the Keth Directorate," the first one said. "There will be consequences." "There already are," Waxman said, without looking up from the terminal. 9 more minutes. Roan moved. He didn't have a plan that extended very far past the next 30 seconds, which was, in his experience, often the most honest assessment of the situation you were going to get. He went for the Keth that was positioning, because the one that was talking was performing, and the one that was moving was working. And in a room with 2 problems, you address the one that was active. He got a hand on the Keth's shoulder and discovered 2 things simultaneously. That Keth were heavier than they looked, and that they were faster than a species, with that mass had any business being. What followed was approximately 3 minutes of the worst interpersonal violence Roan had experienced in the current decade, which was a decade that had not been short on competition. The Keth fought without anger, which was worse than fighting with it. Anger made people predictable. These 2 fought with a kind of applied efficiency that was more like problem-solving than combat. They evaluated, they adjusted, they discarded approaches that didn't work and moved immediately to the next. The room got smaller. Waxman kept downloading. Roan hit the first Keth with a containment vessel and felt genuinely terrible about it for approximately 0 seconds. He used the second Keth's own momentum against it, in a way that his old ICA hand-to-hand instructor would have recognized and probably disowned. He was bleeding from somewhere above his left ear, and his right hand had made one bad contact with a metal surface and was probably going to need medical attention later. "Time," he said. "Done," Waxman said, and pulled the recording device free. They went out the way they came, the maintenance walkway, the cold, the stars and the rock and the slow rotation of the asteroid field below them. Roan's hands were shaking slightly, and he made himself stop that because it wasn't useful. Waxman, to his credit, didn't say anything until they were back inside. "I need to get this to someone who can't be bought," he said. "That list is shorter than it used to be." "I know someone," Roan said. The problem with Pris Halvard was not that she was corrupt. The problem was that she was honest in a system that had arranged itself to make honesty very expensive. She had paid the price of honesty for 22 years, and she was still paying it, which told him something about the specific flavor of stubborn that she was made of. He sent her the files through 3 layers of encryption and a dead-drop account that he'd maintained for exactly this kind of situation. He included a message that said, "This goes to the Outer Systems Independent Press first, then to every Keth neutral diplomatic body in the sector, then to every human rights organization that still operates outside ECA jurisdiction. Not one of them, all of them, at the same time. That's the only way this doesn't disappear." She sent back a single word. "Understood." Then she sent a second message. "They've tagged your biometrics station-wide. You need to leave." Now he was already leaving. The ship he got onto was a mining contractor vessel, registered under a name that had no connection to anything the ICA would find interesting. Piloted by a woman who owed Mara Solon a significant favor, and who asked no questions beyond destination and payment. Waxman was already aboard, sitting in the cargo hold playing his tile game against himself. Mara was not there. Roan did not ask where she was. He thought he knew. They were 3 hours out of Ferris Station when the Keth ship intercepted them. It was faster than anything he'd been on. Faster than anything he'd seen, frankly, which was consistent with everything humans had learned about Keth propulsion. Over 11 years of close study and incomplete understanding. It caught them the way a hawk catches a sparrow, not by speed alone, but by the geometry of the approach, cutting off every exit angle simultaneously, appearing in the one blind spot that any vessel of their class would have. Perfectly executed, coldly efficient. The Keth pilot came aboard without asking permission and stood in the cargo hold with the posture of someone who has already decided how this ends. It was not one of the two from the archive facility. This one was taller, with a quality of attention that made the air in the room feel different. Pressurized, somehow, like the moment before a weather event. It looked at Roan for a long time. "You have taken materials that do not belong to you," it said through its translator. The harmonics underneath the translation were not readable, but the body language was. The stillness, the weight, the complete absence of hurry. "The consequences of this are significant. Tell me about the weapon," Roan said. The Keth's head moved, not a recoil, something more like recalibration. "You do not have the context to understand." "Try me." It was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, something had changed in its voice, some subtle shift that the translator didn't fully capture, but that Roan's animal hindbrain registered as the sound of a thing deciding to tell the truth. "There are threats in this galaxy," it said, "that your species does not yet have the capacity to perceive. Things that move in the deep spaces between star systems. The compound you call Hellfire, modified Hellfire, is effective against certain biological profiles that exist nowhere in your taxonomy and everywhere in ours. We have been fighting this war for 60 years. We came to your species because your chemistry produces something ours cannot." The cargo hold was very quiet. "You were going to use us," Roan said. "Use our industry, our workers, our territory. Let us build the weapon and take the risk and die in the testing. Let us be the factory floor for your war." "We intended to share the technology," the Keth said. In time, Waxman repeated from the corner very softly. "You don't get to decide that timeline," Roan said. "You don't get to make that choice for us. That's not a partnership. That's not even an alliance. That's something else." He looked at the Keth steadily. "If what you're describing is real, if there is something out there that threatens both our species, then you come to us. You sit down with us, you explain it, you let us decide. Not because we're equal, maybe we're not equal yet, maybe you're ahead of us in ways we haven't fully mapped, but because it is our species and our people and our right to know what we're building and why and for whom." The Keth looked at him for a long time. All three eyes. The sensory clusters processing at whatever frequency they processed at, pulling in everything the room contained. "Your files have already been distributed," it said finally. "Yes. This will cause considerable disruption. I expect it will. The Keth Directorate will want to respond. I expect they will." Roan leaned forward slightly. "Let them respond to this. We're not scared of you. We're not grateful enough to be exploited by you. And we are, apparently, stubborn enough to walk out onto the hull of your secret facility in the middle of a station sleep cycle and take what we need with our bare hands." He held the Keth's gaze. "If there's a war coming that you've been fighting for 60 years and losing, maybe what you actually need is partners. Real ones, not labor." The Keth was still for a long time. Long enough that the contractor pilot came back to check on things, and then retreated when she read the room. "There are factions within the Directorate," the Keth said, "who have argued for exactly this position. They have been overruled. They might find the argument easier to make now." "Yes," the Keth said. "They might." It left the way it came, the hatch sealed. The Keth ship held position for several minutes and then altered course, and was gone into the black. Waxman looked at him. "Was that a victory?" "I have absolutely no idea," Roan said honestly. "Did you mean it about not being scared?" Roan thought about it. "About the files going out to 47 different recipients across 3 star systems. About Pris Halvard and her 22 years of expensive honesty. About Joris Solan's small, precise handwriting, and the last thing he'd written before someone decided he'd written enough. About the Keth pilot, who had turned its face toward him for a half-second in a dying ship and shown him something in that glance that he still hadn't quite named. I meant the stubborn part," he said. "The ICA response took 11 days. The Keth Directorate's internal response took longer. The formal diplomatic incident that followed consumed 6 months of interspecies negotiation that Roan read about from a distance. From a rented room in a different part of the station, where his biometric tag had been quietly deactivated by a database administrator whose name he would never know, but whose work he was very grateful for. The Axiom Corp Sokolite operation on the shelf was suspended pending investigation. 3 senior executives were charged under interstellar commerce fraud statutes that had existed on paper for 8 years without ever being used. The charges were real enough to stick, which was a novel experience for everyone involved. The modified Solite stockpile was seized by a joint human-Keth oversight team that contained, for the first time in 11 years of interspecies relations, an equal number of representatives from each side. The Keth members of this team were selected by a faction within the Directorate, whose position had, apparently, become significantly easier to argue in the wake of recent events. Waxman went back to his tile game and his machine parts shop, and did not seek any credit. He seemed genuinely content. Roan thought there was something to learn in that. Mara Solin's name appeared in the final diplomatic framework as a consultant on human safety standards, which was either poetic or ironic and possibly both. She sent him a message that consisted of 4 words. Joris would have liked this. He sent back 2. I know Pris Halvard kept her pension, her rank, and her habit of drinking bad coffee like someone who had given up expecting it to be good. She was promoted 6 months later to a position that gave her actual authority over the evidence archive, which was a joke the universe was apparently capable of making. She called him on the day she was promoted, and they talked for 45 minutes about nothing in particular, which was the most comfortable conversation he'd had in a long time. He went back to his 2-room office. He went back to background checks and missing persons and the petty frauds that human habitation produced the way it produced carbon dioxide. The sign on his door still said Vest Solutions in letters that had never quite dried right, and he stopped minding that. What he thought about, in the quiet hours, was what the Keth had told him. The things in the deep spaces between star systems, the 60-year war, the biological profiles that existed nowhere in the human taxonomy and everywhere in the Keth one. He thought about the fact that the Keth, who were faster and older and ahead of humanity in ways that had not yet been fully mapped, had come to a species they thought they could use, and found instead a species that would steal the evidence right from under them on a maintenance walkway in a vacuum, and then tell them to sit down and negotiate like adults. He thought that was probably information worth having. If there were things moving in the deep black, things that had been pushed the Keth back for 60 years, then they were eventually going to push them here, into human space, into the light of human stars. And when that happened, humanity was going to need to be ready, and readiness was not going to look like compliance or gratitude or quiet industrial exploitation. It was going to look like knowing what you were building, and why and for whom. It was going to look like a woman keeping her brother's files in her coat pocket for weeks, waiting for someone stubborn enough to use them. It was going to look like an old man with a stolen harmonic emitter, who had been waiting 17 years for exactly this moment, and had not given up on it. It was going to look like a lieutenant who lost paperwork in transit, and gave you 40 hours she wasn't supposed to give you. It was going to look like bleeding from above your left ear and your right hand needing medical attention, and telling an alien intelligence to try talking to you like you were worth talking to. Roan Vess sat in his office between the noodle bar and the hydroponic supply depot and looked at the sign that had never quite dried right and thought, yeah, that's probably what it's going to look like. He opened the next case file. He got to work.